and he figured as soon as the chipmunk come into the car, he could get the window up, and he'd have it at least in the vehicle. Not a good idea. Yeah. He did. The chipmunk went into the window, went into the back seat, had the peanuts. He got the window up, and then next thing I knew, he showed up at my office, and he has these little bites all over his forehead and his cheek and his neck, and he says to me, "You've got to go over there and shoot that chipmunk, like I'm going to know which one did it, right?"
This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. Killer chipmunks. You haven't heard anything until you've heard Buzz Caverly and Tim Caverly swap stories. One brother was Baxter State Park director. The other brother was superintendent of the Allagash Wilderness Waterway. When they start telling tales, everything comes to a stop. Today's show is brought to you by Van Raymond Outfitters, Hammond Lumber, O'Neill's Power Equipment, Old Town Trading Post, Dice Arts, EBS, and Napa Auto Parts. Join me now in Corinth. Well, I'm with Tim Caverly, longtime superintendent of Allagash Wilderness Waterway, and Buzz Caverly, longtime director of Baxter State Park. It was actually, Tim, your idea that we should get the two of you together on this radio show so we can swap stories. And I said, oh, my God, getting Tim and Buzz together on one radio show, it's never going to be this good again. So I leaped on it, and we're actually sitting in Buzz's kitchen right now. So, again, welcome to the program, Tim.
Thank you.
And welcome to you, Buzz.
Thank you very much.
All right. I'm looking at the show as story time because you've both had long careers at some of the most unique places and most spectacular places in Maine. So I'd like to do a little story swapping. And I'll start with Tim because Tim writes a lot of his stories and has written some really interesting books about his experience in the Allagash. So why don't you just give me a thumbnail sketch of what your years in the Allagash Wilderness Waterway were like, and then I'll have Buzz talk about, just briefly, what Baxter State Park was like.
Well, I just want to mention our background a little bit. Our dad was a ranger of the Maine Forest Service, which is where we both got our start in the natural resource field. And then, so I spent a lot of time with him working on wildfires around the state. And then when Buzz got his ranger's job in Baxter State Park, I was fortunate because I went into a place where I heard about things like Pomola, the Abenaki god. I walked by where Bambi was born. And then soon learned as a young boy that if I didn't get up in the morning, I'd be in Katahdin Stream in my sleeping bag to get ready to go to work for the day. So it was a great experience, but very fortunate to be in the Maine woods, and then spent 32 years with the Department of Conservation.
And Buzz, you were in Baxter State Park for 46 years, is that right?
Yeah, and it was more of a lifestyle than it was a job. You look forward to getting up and going to work. It's not to say that there wasn't some days that were better than others, but overall there were a lot of experiences and a real privilege to have met Governor Baxter. The first year I started work, he used to come to the park twice a year on inspection trips, spring prior to opening, to look at the facilities, see kind of shape they're in, meet the staff, and then again in the fall as a final wrap-up trip and get feedback from staff. So over the 6 years that he came to the park, I got to see him on numerous occasions and also had an opportunity to meet with him in his office in Portland at one point in time.
Now, when it comes right down to it, you were involved with Baxter State Park longer than Baxter was. Over that time, I'm going to expect that you have some stories that are worth sharing. And just to break it up into categories, I was thinking moose stories. And since you're more likely to have a moose story around water than you are mountains, I'll start with Tim. So, Tim, you got a good moose story for me?
Well, I think so. Andy the Wayward Moose is in one of my books because it's so unique. People seem to enjoy it. That one summer there was a moose that liked to wade out into the middle of the Allagash River. And he'd sit there for an hour or 2 hours to a time. And he'd watch the birds, smell the breeze, whatever he was doing. Well, after a while, Andy would get hungry, and he'd go underwater to get the grass that grew on the bottom of the river there. And the water was so deep in that section of the Allagash that when he went underwater, he'd go completely underwater, completely submerged. The current would smooth out over his back. Well, I'm downriver one day, and I see him sitting there, and so I pull over to the opposite bank. And Andy decided to get something to eat. He went underwater, and he had been underwater 3 minutes, and here comes a canoe paddling around the corner. Now, this canoe had no idea that Andy's sitting in the middle of the river. This canoe gets within 20 feet of the moose, and all of a sudden there's this volcanic eruption of water that shoots up in the air, and this thing appears in front of him. It's got grass hanging off his antlers. There's water running down over his nose, and every time the moose chews, the grass is going around and around his mouth. And I can hear the people in the canoe saying, back paddle fast. What is that thing? We've got to get out of here.
How about you, Buzz? Got a moose story at all?
Well, it's a moose people story, so to speak. As you know, and those who visit the park know, there's a road system there, 46 miles long from the south end to the north end, and there was a DOT worker up there with one of these little orange pickups in the 60s, and he was coming down the road quite fast one morning, and it was early, and he was trying to get to his crews before they get started to brief them. And there was a little moose on the road, and he was traveling south, and the moose was going south. Well, it was going slower than he thought it ought to. A moose, many don't realize it, but a moose at a full gallop or a full run can't make a turn to get off the road. So they trot fast, but they generally like to slow up enough to make that swing to get off. And this animal just wasn't getting off, and the operator decided he could push him a little bit, so he started pushing him with a pickup to a certain point, and then all of a sudden the moose stopped, spun around, put its head down, and ultimately smashed into the grill of the truck and did a lot of damage, put the truck out of commission. And the moral of the story is that you don't push a moose, you give them the opportunity to do what they need to in their kingdom. And if you value the vehicle you're driving and dislike paperwork, it's not a good idea to take them off the road.
I had a funny experience last year along almost the same lines. I was out near Shirley on the way up to Moosehead Lake, and I was in the actual village of Shirley heading back up to Route 15. And a moose was just around the corner, and as soon as I came around the corner, he saw the truck and started trotting up the road. And I was bemused. I slowed down, and then I said, wait a minute. He's going to keep running right up into the road on Route 15. I got to do something, or there could be an accident up there. So I hammer down the gas. I get to the side of him enough to curb him off into the nearest yard just before he gets to Route 15, and sure enough, a car was coming right up the road. If I hadn't done something about that, that could have been a tricky situation.
Yeah, we had a number of those situations in the park where moose would get forced into an oncoming car, and generally the moose would try to get off at that point, and when they did, if they didn't hit either vehicle, they'd get tangled up in the old forestry telephone line. Always hung low, and we lost a lot of them the first few years we had those lines there.
I mean, you've both seen it. How is it possible for a moose with a huge rack to just melt into the woods and disappear?
They tip their head right back onto their shoulder. I've watched them. And how they maneuver that through some of these thickets, it's just almost difficult to understand. Yeah. But they are very effective at that. Yeah.
How about other wildlife stories? Do you have a good bear story at all? I'll go back to Tim.
A
little less so on a river, but
yeah. Well, we have plenty of bear. Bear like to be around people with, especially when they're cooking bacon and beans in the morning. Yeah. We actually had a bear one day that tried to break into a ranger's camp. And the bear got up on the roof of the ranger's camp, was tearing the shingles off because the ranger was actually having baked ham that night for supper, and the bear could smell that. And so the ranger started pounding the roof with a broom handle from the inside, trying to scare the bear. But what the ranger didn't know was a family of skunks had moved in underneath the camp. So when he pounded on the ceiling, it didn't scare the bear so much, but it did scare the skunks. And so this mother and father and about 4 babies all sprayed at the same time, filling the camp full of the odor of skunk. And that did scare the bear. That he came down off the roof, but it also made him very upset. And the ranger had left the window open of his truck. And so the bear climbed in through the window of the truck and tore the seat out of the truck. And the ranger actually drove back, sitting on a 5-gallon plastic bucket, back to Bath, where the man called home. So you never know what you're going to experience in the woods.
Was that in the fall, or was it in the spring?
That was in the July.
Yeah, so he's got to deal with a cabin that stinks to high heaven for the rest of summer.
And every rainy day, you could smell him coming a half mile away.
That's Tim Caverly, retired superintendent of the Allagash Wilderness Waterway. Coming up, a bear story from his brother Buzz Caverly, longtime director of Baxter State Park. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. Welcome back to Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. For today's show, I'm sitting at the dining table in the home of Buzz Caverly in Corinth. He's the retired director of Baxter State Park. His brother Tim Caverly is with us. He's the retired superintendent of the Allagash Wilderness Waterway. We're swapping stories, and coming out of the break, it's Buzz's turn to tell a bear story.
Yeah, but first I got one more quick bear story, moose story. I was a young gung-ho ranger at Russell Pond, first year of employment, and as Tim indicated, the moose would come out into the water and they'd feed on the vegetation on the bottom. And I had a friend in there visiting with me one day, and I decided it'd be fun to have a picture taken riding a moose. And so I said to Rodney Green, who was a young fellow that was camping there at the time, I said, "You paddle a canoe." And I said, I'll get in the front, and we'll paddle as long as his head's under. And when he lifts his head up, we'll stop paddling, we'll just drift and see if we can't get close enough so I can leap onto that animal's back. And you get a picture, and you get it quick. And so we paddled out on the pond. We got up relatively close, and I was about ready for the moose come up with its head to make the jump. And then the thought occurred to me, what if I can't get off and he gets ashore with me? Or if I were to come off quick, because I either missed him or he threw me off, those hoofs are flying all over the place.
Yeah.
And so I said to Rod, second thought, back paddle. And we back paddled away and took a picture of the moose swimming ashore.
In what world would that have made sense?
It wouldn't have, but at that age, it seemed like a challenge.
All right, bear story?
Yeah, there was a bear that is early in the spring in back of, over in the Center Mountain area, would be east of this Out Field. And there was a young man there that decided he wanted to go hunting for moose antlers, which I dropped each winter, and heard that Center Mountain area was a good place to do that. Had gone in looking for antlers and was on the return trip back out when he sensed something behind him and looked around, and there was this yearling bear hobbling along behind him, and just a lobe, really. And this happened over a period of a mile. He would try to step up his speed a little bit to get away from the bear. That didn't work. Finally, he decided to take his shoe off and throw it at the bear, intimidating it, and he did that, and that didn't work. And to make a long story short, he ended up coming to a little bog with a floating island, and he went out to that island thinking the bear couldn't get there. Well, the bear kind of sniffed around the shore for a few minutes, then waded on out to the island. And when he got out there, he figured, the young fellow figured, well, I've heard in Alaska you're supposed to play dead. So he laid down and played dead, and at that point the bear started sniffing him from his feet. And when he got up around his head, he got a little nervous, and he screamed. And when he screamed, the bear jumped back into the bog, went ashore, and disappeared. Well, he came out to the campground ranger, and by the time he got out there, he'd really worked himself up, barefoot on one foot, shoe on the other, and he reported to the ranger that there was a killer bear on the loose in back of Center Pond. Well, this hit the wavelengths, and sooner or later the press, and a young, energetic reporter showed up when they heard that we had been able to live trap a bear. We didn't know it was the same bear, of course, had no way of knowing that, but we knew we had a bear in a cage, and if the word got out that we'd caught a bear, people would assume it was that bear, and the problem would go away. And the reporter came up, and we're at the parking lot at Millinocket with this bear trap, and there's little dart holes cut in the side of the trap so that they can tranquilize the bear if they need to with a jab stick. And he was getting pretty close to those holes, and I said to him, you might want to step back. I said, that bear could very well catch you with a claw or something if you're in there too close. Well, he didn't believe me. He kept going in closer and closer, and all of a sudden that bear leaped from one end of the culvert trap to the other and hit the side of that. And this reporter was one of these Elvis Presley slick hair dress type guy in a white suit and tie, and it scared him to the point his hair went right straight up. The cameraman didn't shut the camera off. And I've always thought, boy, I won't mention his name because he's still reporting today, but it was an experience I don't think he would ever forget.
Yeah. Was it Bill Green?
No.
Just checking.
If it was, I wouldn't tell you.
I've been up to Baxter a lot this year, and for the first time in a long time, I'm seeing fisher cats a lot. It's 3 different times I've had a fisher cat cross the road right up in the Baxter area. There's a lot of other wildlife in there that people forget about, fishes being one. Any other interesting stories about wildlife that aren't big game, moose, bear animals that come to mind?
Well, there's a big game story that was quite unique. In 1962, Ranger Merle Scott and I were traveling into A-Ball Campground, and just before you get to, just after Stump Pond, there's Spring in the Turn. You might be familiar with it. Spring water there that's not used nowadays. But anyway, right there's a pretty large-sized rock beside the road. and a cat had jumped up onto that rock and it came down onto the road, and it had a long tail. Mm-hmm. And I said to Merle, I says, "What was that?" And he said, I don't know. I said, "It's got a long tail, must be a mountain lion." So we carried that story back to the supervisor, and he indicated that there was a time when there was quite a few mountain lions in Canada that were traveling from eastern Canada to western Canada, and it wasn't unheard of that there would be one seen in Maine periodically. And we kind of had to accept that as probably the case, and so we don't know whether we had a mountain lion in Baxter Park or not, but it was a cat with a long tail, and that, what else can we say, right?
Yeah. Somebody in the Allagash Wilderness Waterway must report mountain lions, eastern cougars somewhat regularly. Did you have that experience at all, Tim?
We actually had caught one on film.
Oh, did you?
We were doing some work into the locomotives, jacking them up. My ranger and a helper were on the way back down Little Eagle, and they saw a cat swimming across the water. And as they got close to it and watched it, they thought it had a long tail. And just as the cat came to shore, the ranger remembered he had his video camera with him, and he grabbed his video camera, and the cat moved so fast he only got about 5 seconds. But the ranger and his helper swore that it had the long tail of a mountain lion. We took that film down to the State Police Crime Lab, and they dissected it frame by frame, and we showed those pictures to 10 wildlife professionals. 5 said it had a long tail, 5 said it didn't. And so it's not the solid evidence there's a mountain lion, but you talk to the ranger and that guy with him today, and they'll tell you they saw one.
You're listening to Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. Buzz and Tim Caverly are my guests. For many years, the brothers were in charge of Baxter State Park and the Allagash Wilderness Waterway, where they often had to put up with people from away. We'll swap stories about city folk in the woods next. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. I'm at the dining room table of Buzz Caverly, joined by his brother Tim Caverly, and we're swapping stories of their years in charge of Baxter State Park and the Allagash Wilderness Waterway. They've had to put up with a lot of people from away, coming into the Maine woods and getting in trouble, which does make for some interesting stories. Tim, why don't you go first?
Well, I've got a couple stories, one from someone from away and another one from a local person. The person from away had planned to do the Allagash trip a whole year before they actually got up there. And they got on the waterway, and they knew the insects, black flies, no-see-ums, gnats, horseflies, deer flies were going to be pretty horrendous. And so they took precautions. And I'm canoeing up Long Lake, and I get to Long Lake Dam, and that's a site of an old logging dam, and you have to carry your gear around the dam. So I'm carrying my gear around the dam, and there's a single woman standing on the campsite, and she's burping. All the time I walk by her, she's burping, and extensively. And I finally say, I talk to her and say, there's obviously something wrong, and I can get you help. Is there what you got going on? And she said, well, I knew there'd be a lot of black flies up here, and so I read in a survival book that if you took a packet of Fleshman's dry yeast and put that in a cup of hot water and drank that, it'd cause a chemical reaction within your body which would keep the bugs away. Well, I don't know about the bugs, but it was keeping everybody else away. And she was so embarrassed, I finally just left her alone, and she assured me that she was okay, and then I saw her the next day, and she was fine.
Yeah, my guess is if you drink enough prune juice, you can outrun the bugs for a while.
There you go.
People from away, you must have a good story, Buzz.
Well, you don't know where to start on that. There was a lot of stories that involved serious situations where actually resulted in fatalities, and most commonly known is the very first fatality at Baxter Park, which was this woman from Massachusetts, and a ranger that started work with me in 1960 lost his life in trying to rescue the Ralph Heath situation, and it's tragic. As that story was, it was a long story, so I won't get into the details, but I would make mention that a number of years ago when Steve McCausland of the Department of Public Safety came along and said, we're going to create a memorial for law enforcement rangers, I immediately, who had fallen in the line of duty, I immediately applied Ralph Heath's name to be on that memorial. And the response I got was that because he was a park ranger, he was not law enforcement there, was not qualified. And
response from whom?
Well, the Department of Public Safety at that time. Initially, this was initially, And when I explained to them that in Title 12, Section 901, 905 clearly identified park rangers as having police supervision, that they accepted that verification, and his name was added. And I've always been grateful that I had the opportunity to get Ranger Heath memorialized both at the Augusta as well as what Governor Baxter did at his gravesite in Sherman, recognizing his efforts. Out-of-state visitors, there's no end to the stories. There's the guy that wanted to trap a live chipmunk to take back to wherever he came from, and he set up a box trap with some bait in it, and I happened to walk through the campground. This was at Katahdin Stream, mid-'60s. I asked him what was up. He told me what he's doing. He'd always want to take a pet chipmunk home, and I told him that was inappropriate to remove the trap. Well, he did, and then a little bit later a camper come by and said, that guy's got the trap set again. So I went over and spoke to him again, and we got it removed. And then I got a report that he had set up a trap in his car. He was sitting in his car. He'd left a window open, and he'd put some peanuts on the back seat. And he figured as soon as the chipmunk come into the car, he could get the window up, and he'd have it at least in the vehicle. Not a good idea. Yeah. He did. The chipmunk went into the window, went into the back seat, had the peanuts. He got the window up. And then, next thing I knew, he showed up at my office, and he has these little bites all over his forehead and his cheek and his neck. And he says to me, you've got to go over there and shoot that chipmunk, like I'm going to know which one did it, right? And send it to the laboratory, Jackson's lab, and make sure it hasn't got rabies. And I said, well, we can't do that. You were told not to do it. And I said, I'm not going to try to locate that with Chuck. And he said, how am I going to know whether I got rabies or not? And again, being young and sort of inexperienced in public relations, I said, wait 14 days.
All right, people from away, Tim.
Well, I'd like to share a story about a local guy, if I can.
Okay, local guy.
If you don't mind. This is Henry Taylor, and he's in some of my books, and I think I could do a whole program just about Henry. He was a guide on the river for years, long before there were roads in that country. He had a sporting camp down on the lower river, about 20 miles south of Allagash Village. And in order for Henry to get supplies, he'd have to go about 20 miles down the Allagash and about 35 miles down the St. John River by canoe to pick up supplies in Fort Kent. Then he'd have to pole or paddle back upstream that distance to get those supplies back to his camp. So one day Henry thought, well, if I bought a plane, I could fly to Fort Kent, pick up supplies, be back the same day. So he cut a little runway strip out behind his camp, bought a small plane, learned how to fly, decided to go to Fort Kent for supplies. He got down there and had all his supplies in his plane, and he saw that there was a sale on live pigs. And he said, well, I could use a pig at my camp. And but he worried the pig might not like to fly. So he tied the four legs together and put the pig on the back seat of the plane and took off. Well, the pig didn't care for flying at all, and about halfway back, he came untied. And once it came untied, it started running back and forth inside the plane trying to get out. And the plane was small and the pig was big, and it caused the plane to start doing dips and dives and things that Henry thought he was going to crash at any minute. In his younger days, Henry was quite a big man, so he just made a fist, and he turned around and hit the pig between the eyes. The pig slept all the rest of the way back to camp. And so that's one of the local stories.
Oh, my word. Dramatic rescues. People getting into Baxter State Park or the Allagash Wilderness Waterway can get into trouble an awful long way from help. There must be some stories that particularly come to mind about successful, happy-ending stories of people who really got themselves in deep trouble. Who wants to start?
Yeah, I got to think about that one for a minute, Tim. So why don't you
Okay, Tim will. Okay.
Well, yeah, and I just came back from Allagash Lake, as you may know, Bob, and we're getting ready to release a new book next year. And this is going to be in that, and we went in to do some research, take some pictures. And some people came in canoeing in the lake one day, and they'd forgotten their life preserver. And so they asked the ranger if they could borrow one, and the ranger said, sure. And he gave them a life preserver, and they paddled around the lake for 2 or 3 days and said, well, we're going back to Johnson Pond where the float plane is coming in to pick us up. If you don't mind, we'll take the life preserver back up there with us, and then we'll get it back to you. And he said, that's fine. So they did that, and they got in the plane, they took off. Well, rather than take the life preserver back to Greenville and have it drove in, they decided to drop it out of the plane. And so they fly over the camp, and they throw the life preserver out the side window of the plane. It goes right back and wraps around the elevator fin of the plane, which forces the plane immediately down onto the lake. And so the ranger walked down, and there's these three people, the three passengers in the plane, sitting there with faces just as white as a ghost, because they'd never gone down so fast. But they didn't crash. The pilot got them down onto the water safely, and the ranger got his life preserver back.
Dramatic rescue come to mind for you now, Buzz?
Well, this stout out-of-state woman decided that she would like to do some backcountry camping, so she hiked into Chimney Pond, 3.3 miles, and was setting up camp and doing pretty well. And then right behind her, there was a hiker that came in that wasn't much of a cook, so he carried a lot of canned goods, and he carried those into Chimney Pond and stayed for 2 or 3 days. And on the last day, he got ready to leave, and he brought down some sardine cans, empty sardine cans, baked bean cans, that sort of thing, and was taking them down to ask the ranger where he could put them, when he noticed that the ranger was cleaning out the back pit of one of the outhouses, and he had the door up, the trap door up, to shovel out the pit. And he was working at that, so he walked up to the ranger. He says, where can I throw my trash? And the ranger said, well, this is a carry and carry out facility. You carry it in full, you're expected to carry it out empty. And the lazy hiker didn't like the sound of that, so he kind of went back up to the bunkhouse. And meanwhile, another hiker come along and said, what's the weather going to be today? So the ranger said, let's go down to the ranger station and find out. Well, he left the door there and the wheelbarrow and all of the materials, and he went to the ranger's camp to get a weather forecast. While he was there, the lazy hiker realized that he could probably go right into the outhouse, drop his rubbish down that outhouse hole, and he'd be home free of carrying a load out. So that's what he did. In the meanwhile, the stout lady on the other end of the campground decided she needed to answer the call of nature. So she comes to the outhouse, opens the door, goes in, and plants herself firmly on the seat. Bruin, a little bear, about 2 years old, decided that he could smell some sardines and beans and so forth, and was in for a feed. So he walks up to that trap door, gets down on his haunches like a dog would do, and just kind of crawled in underneath that outhouse pit and started tearing those bags of sardines, cans of sardines and other material apart, and was getting a feed, and all of a sudden he felt water coming down his forehead. And when he did, he reached up with his nose and he cold-nosed the left cheek of this hiker. Well, she screamed, didn't bother to unlock the door, just went right out through it, causing some repair work to the ranger. And last we knew, she was headed down the trail and out of state, and the bear was headed northbound. We don't know whether he went through customs or not.
My guests are Buzz and Tim Caverly. Coming up, what is the scariest thing in Baxter State Park? As Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine continues on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. Yeah, it's Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. I'm Bob Duchesne. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine. And I'm with Buzz and Tim Caverly, now retired, but at one time these two brothers were the head guys in Baxter State Park and the Allagash Wilderness Waterway. Buzz, in all your 46 years of protecting people in Baxter State Park, was there anything that scared you more than lightning on top of Katahdin?
Probably not, because there's no way to anticipate it. And even you can be on top of Mount Katahdin, have a perfectly clear day, and within 15 minutes can be closed right in clouds, and lightning and thunder can run quite quick. We had a couple of people killed in 68, the Newlands. Carol and Scott Newland. Scott was killed instantly. Carolyn died years later from the results. But it comes in, and there's a lot of ore in the rock up there, and consequently it attracts lightning.
No, sadly, I got to see that in person because you may remember, I think it was a Boy Scout killed, I think, by lightning up on top of the mountain in the early 90s.
13-year-old, yes.
Yeah. Well, I was up there about 20 minutes before that, and we saw the storm rolling in, and it came out of nowhere because Mount Katahdin makes its own weather. There really hadn't been anything to track, no cloud system moving in. The weather was good, and then all of a sudden you could just see the clouds rolling in, and we looked at each other and said, "Geez, we got to get off this mountaintop in a hurry." So we get down to a little bit lower and a little bit of shelter, but the folks up on top didn't, and it was kind of tragic. You must have to deal with that, at least the fear, on a constant basis.
It was. It happened a number of times over the years. We've had probably as many as 3 or 4 lightning strikes, fatalities,
Yeah. Both of you had a similar challenge to face. One park is Forever Wild, the other is a designated federal wilderness waterway. You've got to keep these experiences Forever Wild and wilderness at the same time that you're facing a lot of modern challenges, better access, or people who have expectations of gaining access to these places. So you must have had some epic battles trying to keep these values the way they were traditionally designed to be. Baxter State Park in particular, I mean, that's supposed to be forever wild.
Absolutely, and we were very fortunate at Baxter at Baxter Park that Percival Baxter, Governor Percival Baxter, had established over a period of 28 years 32 deeds of trust, separate deeds, and in every one of those deeds, he was very, very clear on what his intent was for the park, to be forever wild, and that not to be impaired upon by superseded by recreation desires. Mm-hmm. So as long as we stayed focused on those trust provisions, we would be successful in managing the park. Now, that didn't mean that there wouldn't be controversies, there wouldn't be debates and arguments over what was right and what was wrong. But any time a manager at Baxter would take a look at the trust provisions and look at Governor Baxter's picture up on the wall and say, Governor, what do I do now? Generally, you would start to focus on the trust provisions, mm-hmm. and if you needed interpretation, there was a lawyer who was specialized at the AG's office that would help you out on that. But the biggest mistake one can make in managing Baxter Park is let the recreation values or research values become so important that they overlook the wilderness provisions.
So at least with the trust set up the way they were and the original vision of Governor Percival Baxter, it is first and foremost going to be a forever wild wilderness experience.
Yes, and that doesn't mean that there aren't different management zones. It's, you have the big W and the little W, but obviously where there are campgrounds and there are roads and even trails to some extent, it's not pure wilderness. But then you've got an area in the park that it's extremely important to protect is the Wasatch Valley, which has some recreational facilities remote, but also the Klondike area, which is pure wilderness. And mm-hmm. I've always said that there's a desire always to challenge that by going into it and being part of it. And as I told a reporter one time who wanted me to guide her in, I said I won't do it simply because there has to be one place in the state of Maine where you can lay your head down on the pillow at night, wherever you are, and know that nature is interacting with itself in the Klondike of Baxter State Park, and therefore it would be inappropriate for anybody to decide they need to violate that feature. Yeah.
But it has meant over the years, obviously, you had to deal with access issues, how many roads go in there, what gets closed off, what gets used, where can snowmobiles go.
Absolutely right, yes. And we've dealt with it all the way from removing obsolete cabins to motor vehicle sizes, limitations on vehicle sizes on the road, not modifying the road to accommodate the vehicle, but to put restrictions on the size of the vehicle that's compatible with the road. Snowmobiles is obviously another big issue. The list goes on, and during my 46 years there, I was generally in a position where I was involved in all of those.
That's what I think makes this an interesting conversation, because you guys know where the bodies are buried. Allagash Wilderness Waterway. Well, the same situation.
When you you don't really need to manage wilderness, because wilderness gets along just fine on its own. Mm-hmm. What you manage is people.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of people that think that they have the right answers to managing whatever the issue is, and they want to manage to accommodate what they want to accommodate and not what you and I want to accommodate. Right. And the Allagash bisects 3 million acres of working forest, which leads it to have a lot of just natural conflicts. And it doesn't have the deeds of trust that Baxter has, which is unfortunate, which was served the Allagash well too. But there's there are always people that, and that's why it's important to reach out, like you're doing, Bob, with education to explain why these places are special. And I would challenge anybody to start a fire in their fireplace in the wintertime, shut the radio and TV off, and think about the words of Baxter Park and Allagash for a little bit, and see what comes to mind.
Actually, where I live, and I'm just over in Hudson, I lose power often enough that I have to start a stove
to lose the TV.
So I know what that experience is like.
That is wilderness, right?
Some days. You've got to fight the additional battle of, you want this to be open and accessible to the public. You want the people of the state of Maine and elsewhere to be able to enjoy these resources, but in order to preserve the values there, you have to have some kind of limit of access. And so that's a trade-off you have to make all the time. And it's probably a similar trade-off you have to make between both those resources, Baxter and the Allagash.
Well, the wilderness values, of course, are the priority, and as Tim has indicated, managing people is a challenge when you do that. On the other side of the coin, Governor Baxter, every time that I ever met him, or every time he ever came to the park, and well, even the time I went to Portland to meet in his office, the one thing that he would always ask, and it wasn't just me, it was any ranger you run into, are the people enjoying their park. Mm-hmm. He wanted the people of Maine to realize that he was saying thank you to them and the future generations. In fact, he was once asked, how do you justify spending your family's wealth and all these years, 28 years, putting this park together? And why did you do it, Governor? Why did you go to all that effort? And he said the people of Maine were gracious enough to elect me to their legislature, to their Senate, as president of the Senate, and ultimately I got to serve as the chief executive of the state. And I want to say thank you to those people, not only this generation, but the generation to come. And that's my sole purpose in creating Baxter State Park. And I always have to add to that, wouldn't it be wonderful if our politicians today would think about that type of generosity and commitment to the constituents? And you don't see, not that they've got to go out and buy the highest mountain in Maine, right. It's already been bought, yeah. But the fact that they appreciated the service to the extent that they were willing to make strong commitments in fulfilling their obligations of office.
All right, I've got to fulfill an obligation to the sponsors. We'll take a break, then get right back with Buzz and Tim Caverly, swapping stories about Baxter State Park and the Allagash on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. You're listening to Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine, and I'm in Corinth, sitting in the kitchen of Buzz Caverly, longtime director of Baxter State Park. Tim Caverly is here. He managed the Allagash for decades. One thing that makes Percival Baxter's vision so amazing to me is that my Maine license plates still get me into Baxter State Park free, Buzz.
It's interesting. A number of years ago, a governor came to visit the park, and I had the pleasure of giving him the guided tour while the commissioners and others are having a meeting in Millinocket. I got to take the governor and his wife and children up into the park. And as we approached Togue Pond Gate, he said to me, he says, I'd really like to do something special for the people of Maine. And I said, what's that, Governor? He said, I'd like to provide free access to Baxter Park for Maine residents for day use. And he'd just come by the sign that says there was an $8 fee, entrance fee for non-resident vehicles. Mm-hmm. And I let him present his case for probably about the next mile and a half. And then I said, well, Governor, he says, Maine people aren't charged day use fee now. And he said, they aren't. He said, they are state parks. I said, not at Baxter. I said, they're taken care of. And I thought to myself, maybe my Dale Carnegie wasn't paying off. I probably shouldn't have pointed that out to him at that point in time.
No, I think a lot of politics is educating the governor. I won't lie is. You got a different situation of the Allagash, though, because it is a federally designated wilderness waterway.
Well, it is. It was voted for by the referendum for the people of Maine to set aside, and the Department of Conservation was instructed to manage it to develop maximum wilderness character. Mm-hmm. What that means depends on who you're talking to.
Yeah, exactly.
And then in 1970, our Congressman Ed Muskie said that worried that state protection might not be enough, so he worked with the National Park Service to have become a wild and scenic river in the National Wild and Scenic River System. So it is classified wild river on the national basis. And it's a place where people all over the world come to visit, and it is a real treasure. And again, will an area like the Allagash be managed for the natural character it represents, which we all think of when we think of the word Allagash, or will it be managed for the politics of the day? And I think that's the question for our future generation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Henry David Thoreau, literary genius or overrated?
He actually came to the Allagash on his way to Baxter Park on one of his trips, and so we were camped at Thoreau's campsite on Pillsbury Island on Eagle Lake. I've read some of his work. He's recognized all over the world by leaders for helping us look at our natural environment in a different way, and people look up to him a lot today. Mm-hmm. And it took me a while to discover Henry David, and I haven't read all his work yet. It's hard to describe how you feel about the woods. Yeah. And I think he did it very well.
What's your view on that, Buzz?
Well, he was a great naturalist, but he never made it to the top of Katahdin.
No. There must have been trails up there at the time.
Not really. No. He was hiking up from the West Branch and basically followed the A-ball route, as I understand it, and run into conditions and weather and so forth where he was never able to complete the trip. But
Well, as a matter of fact, neither place has really changed dramatically. Buzz, you were there for 46 years. Not much at Baxter State Park has changed since I started going there decades ago.
There's been some additional changes, yes. Additional facilities, additional trails. The road is obviously different now than it was with the old tow-behind grader with the power graders. But nature itself is certainly caused some widening of that. Mm-hmm. When I first went up there, there was a one-lane traffic, a whole bunch of turnouts, and a big old red sign as you entered the foot of A-Ball Hill. It said, Nassau to Tote Road, narrow and winding, blow your horn on corners.
How many collisions happen? Because that's a narrow road. People come around the corner faster than 20 miles an hour. I've had a number of people who made me swerve to the side several times. There must be some people who don't swerve successfully in time.
A lot of fender benders, and it's really generally caused twice a day. Once in the morning, they're anxious to get up there and hit the trail, and they're moving faster than they should. Mm-hmm. And then again, late afternoon, they're coming off the mountain. They're hot, tired, sweaty, hungry. They want to get a shower, and then they want to eat. Mm-hmm. And they're driving it from Millinocket. And you can't convince them to slow down until they have the big one.
All right, Allagash, how much has that changed in all the years that you've been involved with that?
Well, there's been some changes. There's a concrete dam at Churchill, which when that was built in 1968, it was made wooden to blend in with the experience, but because of the economy, cost of materials and length of service, a wooden dam would last over a concrete dam. They built concrete. It remained to be seen whether that was a good decision or not. There's a few more access points. As they log up there, they're always building more roads, so there's constant opportunity to get more vehicle access.
Now, both of you have written about your experiences and also some fiction in your case, Tim. Let me start with your book, Buzz. That's still in print?
Yes, it is.
Okay, what's the title and where can I find it?
Wilderness Partners. Mm-hmm. And I believe L.L. Bean still carries it, and there's probably bookstores. I haven't checked lately. But, yeah.
And then, of course, Tim, who writes as well, is carrying your book on his website, and it's available right from you.
Yes, I do a lot of programming at craft fairs, sporting shows, those kind of things. And we have that Buzz's book as well as my 5 books. But we've also found an old case of my Aunt Eleanor's books, which are brand new but are 50 years old. And she wrote in her days when she used to hike with Buzz when he was a young ranger. So we have those that be at our booth now as well. Mm-hmm. And so we're having a great reception of that.
Yeah. So what is your website?
My website is AllagashTales.com. It's T-A-I-L-S, AllagashTales.com. Mm-hmm. And I am doing programming all over New England now to talk about our books, our experiences in the woods. And if folks would like to see where I'm going to be speaking so they can come visit, if they check the events link on that website, AllagashTales.com, hopefully we can tell them a story they never heard before.
Well, this is the second time I've had you on Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine. Yes. You're an outstanding storyteller. So this is an opportunity for people to line you up to come speak to their garden club, nature society,
We do a lot of assisted living right down to Cub Scout troops, and we get a tremendous amount of support. Our books are being used in Maine, New Hampshire, and Mass schools now. There's a huge amount of interest in Maine. I knew it was big when I was a ranger, but it's bigger than I ever imagined.
Well, any last thoughts about what story should each of you have told that you forgot about? Tim, go ahead.
Can I tell 2?
Sure. Okay. Absolutely.
Well, as I mentioned, I was in Allagash Lake, and one day we was in there paddling, and it was dead calm water, flat all day long. And we paddled almost the whole length, and my wife and I, Susan, got back to the campsite that night, and we were tired. We went to bed early. Well, when the dark approached, the barred owl started calling. Mm-hmm. And he was calling his who cooks for you, who cooks for you call. Well, the next cove over, the great horned owl started calling his who call. Mm-hmm. And so we were laying in tent listening to who cooks for you, who cooks for you, who, the old Abbott and Costello kind of routine. We just say there and laugh. But I guess the story that comes back to mind quite often, that I'm not sure I share with Buzz all that much, is that when when he went to Baxter Park as a ranger, he said, "Come on up, Tim, there's a mountain to climb, there's trout to catch." And I think within a week I was on the way to Baxter Park, where I spent most of my summers till I was old enough to get my own ranger's job. Well, at Katahdin Stream Campground, there was an old Jeep, and it didn't always run right, but I just got my license, and I was proud to sign up as a volunteer and be able to run that Jeep. And Buzz said, "Well, if you will clean the outhouses, then that you can use the Jeep to haul your material to the outhouses." I think those outhouses get cleaned about 12 times a day. and I'm at the furthest outhouse in the campground one day, and the Jeep won't start. and I figured the battery's dead. And there's some campers that came over and said, can we help? And I said, sure. And so they pushed me all over that campground trying to jump start that Jeep. Well, it didn't have a gas gauge, and so I took a piece of cedar kindling that we had to measure gas in the tank, and I stuck that down in there, and I found out that the Jeep was out of gas, so they pushed me all over the campground. And I'm not sure if Buzz ever knew that story or not.
Got a last story to tell, Buzz?
Yeah, you indicated we ought to tell one on each other, and I immediately thought of a couple, but I will just stick with one, which I thought was kind of cute for the times. Tim was attending college down in Machias, and he had some time off coming to him, and he wanted to get a job, so he applied for the survey crew for the Allagash Waterway to go up and run survey. And he'd been up there for about a week or 10 days, and he came down, been a long spell in the woods, living kind of rustically. He came down, and I said, how'd it go? And he says, pretty good. He said, but that fellow that they sent up there to work with me, he's the laziest man I ever met in my life. I says, how's that, Tim? And he said, well, every morning, he said, I have to stay in bed until 10 o'clock before he'll get up and build a fire.
Well, Buzz Caverly, Tim Caverly, thank you so much for being on Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, Bob.
Buzz and Tim Caverly, two brothers who were in charge of managing Baxter State Park and the Allagash Wilderness Waterway for decades. Remember Tim's website, AllagashTales.com. And remember our website if you want to hear the show again or recommend it to others, 929theticket.com. Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine is brought to you by Van Raymond Outfitters, Hammond Lumber, O'Neill's Power Equipment, Old Town Trading Post, Dysarts, EBS, and Napa Auto Parts. Join me next Saturday morning at 9 a.m. on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket.